How you guys doing? Your boy Diablo, Diablo TV, IMF into Miami Firm, Miami Casuals, and of CBC, Colorblind Crew, Colorblind County, South Florida Skinheads, in the past, Florida Sharp, and the subject today is Skinheads. And there's a lot of confusion out there, which is deliberate on behalf of the media, or let's say the mainstream media, and it's in their interest to portray skinheads one way or just portray one side of the skinhead movement, because they use skinhead as a boogeyman, they use skinhead as a villain in movies. And when the skinhead movement first came to the public, or became known to the U.S. public, I was already a skinhead. I was already anti-racist skinhead sharp at the time when the Geraldo show came out and the fight occurred. But the media right there knew that there was two sides, at least, of skinhead. There was racist ones and anti-racist ones. And if you look at the Geraldo show, you'll see that's what they had. They had the two sides separated, and those were who was fighting. Once the fella started choking Tom Metzger's son on stage, and the chair was thrown, blah 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 blah, and the fight occurred, it was anti-racist skinheads and racist skinheads fighting each other. So the question becomes, when people say, well, what's an anti-racist skinhead? Because they just think a skinhead means something to do with racism, when it has nothing to do with racism, at least not initially. Skinhead is a youth cult or a subculture, which could be accurately compared to hippies, punk rockers, hip hop. These are youth cultures that have a fashion. They often have some sort of loose ideology, if not go into some sort of politics. There's either sometimes they're working class, or maybe they come from a upper class. So there's certain things that bind everybody together. It's tribalism. So skinhead is a product of two previous youth cults, which is mods and rude boys. So to tell it to everybody briefly, and this is something you can research. I've been involved since 1987, and there's countless thousands and thousands and thousands of songs and books, and there's a lot of research that can be done. All you gotta do is look up anti-racist skinheads, traditional skinheads, sharp skinheads against racial prejudice, and there's plenty of information out there. So basically, in the early 60s, there's a massive emigration from Jamaica to England. They had hard financial times. A lot of people was going to England seeking to better their lives. And the prevailing youth cultures, cults, subcultures, styles at that time in Jamaica and England were rude boys. And then in Jamaica, this is like prior to the Rastafarianism. Like Bob Marley and stuff, they're rude boys. They got short hair, pork pie hats, tonic suits, riding around on scooters, doing gangster stuff. The harder they come. Jimmy Cliff. The harder they come, the harder they fall. One and all. You watch that film, that's rude boy. You see the way they dress, you see the way they act. It's hard, it's violent. So in England at that time, the prevailing youth cultures, as typified by the film Quadrophenia by The Who, is mods and rockers. So then rockers, everybody knows what a rocker is, and that's either a hippie or a biker. All those could be considered rockers. Kind of dirtier, longer hair, rougher, and earthier, you could say. And then you have your mods, and not everybody knows what that is, but mods, if you look at the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who when they're younger, they have cleaner haircuts, they're more clean cut looking, clean lines, wearing suits and stuff like that. That's mod. And you can look up mod on your own. That's its own subject, and I'm not no expert on mod culture, although I'm parallel with them around it. I like it, and the things I am come off of it. So you have mods, and then within the men, a lot of these mods they're working class. Their kids like to fight, even though they like to dress good. That comes off of Teddy Boys. That's even an older one, and all these have to do with working class kids, and some identify as working class and want to look rough, let's say, and others want to better themselves, and others want to dress up nicer and look good, and the idea is looking smart, looking sharp, and also looking mean, tough, hard, clean and mean, almost like a Johnny Cash type of ethic, if you think of it that way. So you got these mods, and within the mod scene, you got your hooligans, football hooligans, guys into football violence, into the football gang scene, and going and getting in trouble, going to borstos, basically detention centers, youth programs, and all that kind of stuff. And these guys are also called hard mods, and they got shorter hair a lot of time. They're meaner kids. So, and some people would say that the hard mod is a later term for something, but at any rate, you got to create Skinhead, which is a youth culture. Forget about politics. There's no politics yet. This is still mid 60s. The white power skinheads don't come out till the 80s. That thing that people are used to, and the people that Hollywood portrays, is real easy to see the skinhead history. That's in the 80s. And the skinhead starts in Jamaica in the 60s with the Jamaican style of rude boy. So many styles are from Jamaica and then personified in England. And that combination right there really has led from dubstep to skinhead. There's so many things that come from that cross-pollination of those two cultures. And when we go into skinhead, it's like the same two kind of kids. Hard kids, street kids, short hair, when everybody else is long hair hippies. So skinhead is also termed as a reaction against hippie, because mod is the common source of both. Because the hippie movement is these same guys who are mods that I mentioned, the Beatles and the Who and so forth, taking psychedelic drugs and getting into into Eastern philosophy and so forth, and shaggier hair and hippies and flares and all that kind of stuff. So from mod, those guys, people felt betrayed, the culture, and then you can look at skinhead as a reaction to that. So these guys went in a completely different direction. They listen to black music, and I'll go into that tale in a moment. But you get the skinhead element. That's as far off as hippies you can get. Violent, working class, short hair. So your hard mod, your hooligan mod, these tough white kids, the toughest white kids in England, toughest white dudes, predecessors of skinheads. You would think that all these Jamaican immigrants coming, early 60s, mid 60s, you would think that the predecessors of skinheads, these hard mods, hooligan mods, you would think that they would be the ones who would be opposed to these guys. Because basically the whole of England was somewhat opposed to them. All these Jamaicans coming, there was a lot of racism at the time. A lot of people talk about it. I'll let them tell those tales. But in these real working class or real lower class, poor type of neighborhoods where a lot of these Jamaicans were moving, that's why you had your hardest white kids, your hooligan mods and so forth. And in those neighborhoods, these Jamaican fellas started bringing their sound system, the sound system culture. That's another one I like to talk about sometimes, and like to start trying to help personify that once again in the actual building of the speakers and the sound systems and sound system battle. It still goes on down here in South Florida with Jam Pony Express and High Power Funk and some of these others. But so with the sound system culture and the ska music, they're in these working class white neighborhoods, and they're bringing their style and their girls and their music and their way of dressing. And you would think the predecessors of skinheads, these hard mods, would be giving them a hard time, but it was the opposite. These dudes seen them, and they started going to those bars and listening to that music, and they taught them to spliff, and they started banging some of the Jamaican girls, and them dudes started banging some of their girls, and more or less, that all became one culture. And the way I see it is that it was a one-upsmanship, which is constantly talked about in these British street cultures, trying to outdo the next man or the next group. So it was like the mods listened to soul and to rock and different sorts of things that were accessible, I think, to everybody. Whereas this was something real underground. It wasn't on the radio and stuff. It was just in these neighborhoods. So the hard mods, who would become the skinheads, they attached themselves to that music. That became their music. Hence, skinhead reggae. So the first form of music associated with skinheads is skinhead reggae. You got the Oi and the RAC, Rock Against Communism. That's later. That's in the late 70s and 80s. The white power skinheads listen to RAC. They listen to Rock Against Communism, also called white power rock and roll. So that's in the 80s, though. That's much later. We're talking about now, still 60s. So by mid 60s, this thing becomes one style. By, I would say, somewhere around 65 or something. Different people have different accounts of it, but this thing started turning into one style. There's different names: Spy Kids, Lemon Heads, Boiled Eggs, and Skinheads. And skinhead initially, believe it or not, I looked in the old dictionary. I don't think it says this anymore. But it was actually a derogatory term for a black person, because a lot of them had shaved heads and shorter hairs and stuff like that, And so it was actually a derogatory term to call a black person a skinhead. And there's some famous sample that has it in it. I would have to look it back up. But at any rate, basically, it's the only youth culture that's created equally by black and white youth. because even though rock and roll was started by blacks, typically you think of rock as a white thing. So blacks and that is kind of like whites, blacks and a white thing. And then in hip hop, whites rapping, obviously they have their place, but it's still in a black and Latino culture. So skinhead is the only culture that was created equally by black and white youth. Period. Rude boy and hard mod, those two elements became one. It became one scene, and that's always how it was. That the music of Skinhead is all Jamaican artists: Prince Buster, Desmond Decker, Skinhead Reggae, and all the Claudette the Corporation, Bob Marley, Toots and the Maytals. That's all Skinhead Reggae. So later on, when punk rock comes out, this is another tale. The creation or the evolution of Nazi skinheads and white power skinhead movement. That all comes much later from punk rock. And it's an offshoot of punk, you could say, and a different version of punk. And then the National Front gets involved, and they bring the politics in, and it has to do with the football scene there as well. And then their Nazi skinhead movement is, by the mid '80s, a big thing. So skinheads comes from Jamaica in the mid '60s and develops in England, you could say, because a rude boy is the essential element to being a skinhead, and it was mixed with the prevailing mod scene at the time, you could say. Then we go to the '80s. With your white power skinhead movement. By the time you get to mid '80s, then you have Anti-Fascist Action 1985 in England, Sharp 1987. For a lot of those skinheads, we had anti-racist skinheads here in the early '80s because the people who started our scene here are multicultural. So then, as you get into your anti-racist skinheads, eventually by 1993, under different circumstances, then you have rash, red and anarchist skinheads. So now you start actually having communist skinheads, which I feel came in response. And I'm a rash, I joined rash, I believe in it. So it's a response, as far as me, to be the opposite extreme end. If they want to be Nazis, okay, well, we're communists. Because they already called us communists anyway. They were always communists upon the commies. So I came to realize that Nazis hate communists more than anything else. They hate communists more than Jews, more than blacks. They think communism is a Jewish invention. And no wonder, because communists defeated them. Stalin. And I'm Stalinist. Hence, and the hammer and sickle and the swastika are opposite symbols. All right, so I think I'll pretty much leave it there, because once you get to the point of Rash 1993, not too much new has happened within the skinhead scene beyond that. There's other strange forms that people pick up and create kind of their own skinhead, because ultimately it's an interpretation, and you can make it into what you want to make it into. There's gay skinhead scene, has nothing to do with ours. There's some skinheads that are gay, but I mean there's a gay fetish, like a porn fetish called skinhead, and it's real strange, but they dress up as skinheads, and they do their porn and have sex like that because they think it's macho. So there's even a gay fetish skinhead scene. But then there's been the so-called Pink Panthers and gash gay American skinheads that fight against people who are fag bashing. So you have communist skinheads, Nazi skinheads, white power skinheads. You have traditional skinheads who are original skinheads who just like the reggae music and don't listen to any of the punk. Then you have Oi boys, Oi skins. I listen to Oi. I'm more into that kind of thing, which is kind of more a punk version of it. You got hardcore skins, American style mixed with the hardcore music. G skins, gangster skins, like I was an originator of mixing with the street gang. So ultimately, you can almost take skinhead and make anything out of it. It has certain things that there's principles that are involved, a certain attitude, a certain look, but ultimately, skinhead is infinite. Skinhead is a style that's been around since the '60s, not going to go anywhere. It's going to keep changing, it's going to keep evolving, and it's interesting to see what turns it'll take in the future. As for me, I progressed from skinhead to football casual, and that's a subject for another matter, or matter for another video, let's say. But this is some of the basics of the skinhead movement. Just know that it's multicultural in origin. But with that being said, I'm not going to say that the Nazi skinheads, we call them boneheads, we don't acknowledge them as skinheads, but I'm not going to say that they're not real skinheads, let's say that. They're a different version, they came later, as long as they acknowledge that traditional skinheads are first and white power Nazi skinheads came after. I'm happy, and if the general public would ever know it, that the majority of skinheads are not racist, and the racist is one side of it, and that in fact, skinhead was the only culture ever created on the street by youth that's equally black and white, Jamaican and English. And hence, that's why you see my wreath is black and white, two-tone. So then when you talk about the two-tone movement, specials and everything like that, that'll give you another, you talk about two-tone ska and all this, the checkerboards. You go into that, you're going to find a whole nother world. But I think I gave you enough data for one night. So y'all do your research, and to all my anti-racist, anti-fascist skinhead brothers and sisters out there, respect, cheers, oi, oi, oi. No, see you next time.